Judge laughs at black woman in court, then freezes when she flashes her USSS badge. You think you know the law better than me? The judge sneered, his tone dripping with arrogance as he leaned back in his chair. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on the calm black woman standing before him. She didn't flinch, didn't falter. Instead, she met his condescending gaze with quiet strength, holding a secret that would soon change everything. Want to know what shook this courtroom to its core? Stay tuned with Adam Alpha to find out. The morning sun filtered through the towering glass windows of the Fulton County Courthouse, casting long streaks of light across the marble floors. The air inside the courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the kind of energy that comes when lives hang in the balance. At the defendant's table sat Angela Monroe, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her dark brown eyes scanned the room, noting every detail, the smug smirk on the prosecutor's face, the hushed whispers among the spectators, the steady but faintly judgmental gaze of the jury. Her brother, Marcus Monroe, sat beside her, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though it were the only thing keeping him grounded. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 30s, his usual confidence stripped away by weeks of relentless accusations. The charge of resisting arrest hung over him like a storm cloud, despite video evidence showing otherwise. Angela reached over and placed a reassuring hand on his. "Stay calm, Marcus," she whispered, her voice steady and soothing. "The truth always comes out. Just hold on a little longer." What happens when a judge's arrogance meets an unshakable truth? Keep watching Adam Alpha to see how this courtroom battle unfolds. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, and a hush fell over the courtroom as Judge Bernard Whitman entered, his black robe billowing as he strode to his seat. He was a man in his late 60s, with a sharp nose, thinning white hair, and an air of self-importance that preceded him. His reputation for being harsh and often biased wasn't just a rumor, it was practically a badge of honor among his peers. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced, his deep voice echoing off the walls. Judge Whitman settled into his high-backed chair, scanning the room with a look of disdain that barely concealed his weariness. His eyes landed on Angela, and his lips curled into a faint smirk, as though he had already decided what he thought of her. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, barely audible but loud enough for the front rows to hear. Angela didn't flinch. She had dealt with men like him before, men who saw her skin color before her credentials, who judged her appearance before her words. She had learned to let their arrogance roll off her like water on stone. The prosecutor, Daniel Reed, rose to his feet with a theatrical flourish, adjusting his tie as if preparing for a grand performance. "Your Honor," he began, his voice dripping with confidence, "the evidence against the defendant is clear. This is a case of blatant disregard for law enforcement, and no amount of excuses can erase that." Angela's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. She had promised Marcus she would let the lawyers do their job, even if every fiber of her being wanted to stand up and set the record straight. Reed continued, his words painting Marcus as a volatile, dangerous man who posed a threat to society. Angela's stomach churned with every exaggeration, every half-truth. When he finally finished, he sat down with a satisfied smirk, as though victory were already his. Judge Whitman turned his attention to Marcus's defense attorney, a young, nervous man who seemed to shrink under the judge's gaze. "Well," the judge barked, "do you have anything to say, or are we just going to sit here wasting my time?" The attorney stumbled over his words, his voice barely audible. Angela felt a pang of frustration. This wasn't going to end well unless someone took control. As the trial progressed, Judge Whitman's disdain for Angela became more apparent. He interrupted her lawyer's statements, dismissed objections with a wave of his hand, and even let out an audible sigh when Angela rose to testify as a character witness. "Miss Monroe," the judge drawled, leaning back in his chair, "I hope you're not here to waste my time with sentimental nonsense. We deal in facts here, not feelings." Angela met his gaze, her expression calm but unyielding. "I'm here to speak the truth, Your Honor," she replied evenly. "Nothing more, nothing less." A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom, but the judge silenced them with a glare. "Very well," he said, his tone mocking. "Let's hear what you have to say." Angela stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She could feel every eye on her, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her shoulders. But she didn't falter. Years of training had taught her how to remain composed under pressure, and she wasn't about to let a pompous judge rattle her. She spoke clearly and confidently, recounting the events leading up to Marcus's arrest and painting a picture of a man who had been unfairly targeted. But every time she tried to elaborate, Judge Whitman cut her off, his tone growing more impatient with each interruption. "Miss Monroe," he said with a condescending chuckle, "you seem to think you're some kind of expert on law enforcement. Tell me, do you have any actual experience in the field, or are you just another armchair activist?" Angela felt a spark of anger flare in her chest, but she forced it down. This wasn't the time, not yet. As she returned to her seat, the judge's laughter echoed in her ears. She glanced at Marcus, whose knuckles had turned white from gripping the table. "It's not over," she whispered, her voice firm. "Trust me, it's not over." Little did Judge Whitman know, the woman he had so easily dismissed was far more than she appeared, and soon, the truth would shatter his smug facade. The courtroom's energy was a living, breathing thing, thick with tension, thrumming with unspoken words. Every tick of the grand clock mounted high above the judge's bench seemed louder than the last, as if counting down to an inevitable explosion. Angela Monroe sat quietly, her composure a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil beneath her calm exterior. She had been in high-pressure situations before, but none quite like this, none where the stakes were so personal. Across the room, Judge Bernard Whitman leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. His expression was one of thinly veiled contempt as he tapped his pen against the edge of his desk, a small but pointed reminder of his authority. He wasn't just dismissing Angela, he was challenging her very presence in his courtroom. "All right, Miss Monroe," Judge Whitman said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you've had your say. Now let's get back to the real issue at hand, your brother's blatant disregard for the law." Angela's hands tightened into fists beneath the table, her knuckles pressing against her thighs. She exhaled slowly, a practiced technique she had mastered over years of managing tense situations. "Control the moment, don't let the moment control you," she reminded herself. It was a mantra she had lived by, one that had carried her through grueling Secret Service operations. But here, in this courtroom, under the judge's glare, it felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. The prosecutor, Daniel Reed, rose to his feet again, adjusting his lapel as though preparing for an encore. His voice rang out, smooth and calculated. "Your Honor, I believe we've heard enough theatrics for one day. The evidence clearly shows that the defendant resisted arrest. Video or not, it's the officer's testimony that carries weight." Angela's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile threatening to surface. She'd reviewed that same video a dozen times. It wasn't just clear, it was damning. The officer in question had escalated the situation, shoving Marcus without provocation and drawing his weapon over what should have been a routine traffic stop. But it wasn't just about the video. It was about power, bias, and the narratives that people like Judge Whitman and Daniel Reed spun to keep their status quo intact. Angela leaned toward her brother, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're pushing a story that won't hold up. Stay steady, Marcus. This isn't over." He nodded, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his unease. Marcus had always been the strong one, the protector. Seeing him here, vulnerable and shackled by a system designed to fail him, filled Angela with a slow-burning anger she hadn't felt in years. The judge cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Angela again. "Miss Monroe," he began, "before we move forward, I have to ask, what qualifies you to speak so passionately about law enforcement procedures? You seem quite confident for someone with no real-world experience." The question hung in the air, dripping with mockery. The spectators exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the judge's audacity. Angela tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to convey her growing irritation. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she replied evenly, "I believe my testimony speaks for itself. I witnessed the events firsthand, and I've reviewed the evidence thoroughly." Judge Whitman chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that reverberated through the room. "Thoroughly, you say? And yet you fail to recognize the limitations of your perspective. But please, continue to enlighten us. After all, I'm sure your thorough review will somehow overturn years of legal precedent." The courtroom erupted into muffled laughter, the kind that Angela had grown accustomed to, the laughter of those who underestimated her. She didn't react, didn't flinch. Instead, she held the judge's gaze, unblinking and unshaken. As the afternoon wore on, the defense attorney made a feeble attempt to introduce new evidence, statements from witnesses who had seen the arrest, documentation of the officer's prior misconduct. But Judge Whitman waved it away with a dismissive hand. "This is irrelevant," he declared, his tone final. "We're not here to relitigate the past. We're here to address the facts of this case, not to chase ghosts." Angela's grip on the edge of the table tightened. She had seen this tactic before: reduce, redirect, dismiss. It was a strategy designed to strip the defense of any foothold, to control the narrative before it could shift. And it was working. But Angela had one advantage Judge Whitman hadn't accounted for: her patience. She wasn't here to play his game. She was here to end it. As the session drew to a close, the judge announced a brief recess. Angela rose from her seat, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor as she stepped out into the hallway. The air outside the courtroom was cooler, but it did little to ease the tension coiled in her chest. Marcus followed close behind, his voice low and strained. "Angie, I don't know how much more of this I can take. That man, he's already made up his mind. It doesn't matter what we say." She turned to face him, her hands gripping his shoulders. "Listen to me, Marcus. This isn't over. Not yet. You don't have to fight this alone." He searched her eyes for a moment, the weight of his fear and frustration palpable. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly under her touch. Angela glanced back toward the courtroom doors, her mind already racing. She had held back long enough, let Judge Whitman dig his own grave with his arrogance. When the court reconvened, it would be time to act, time to show the judge and everyone else in that room exactly who she was. And this time, she wouldn't hold back. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as everyone filed back into their seats. The heavy doors groaned shut, sealing the room once again in an almost oppressive atmosphere. Angela Monroe stepped back to the defendant's table, her heels clicking deliberately against the polished marble. Her every step seemed measured, deliberate, yet filled with purpose. Marcus followed behind her, his head slightly bowed but his shoulders a fraction less tense than before. Angela had said something to him during the recess, something that steadied him. Whatever it was, he clung to it like a lifeline. Judge Bernard Whitman re-entered the room shortly after, his robe billowing behind him like a cape of authority. He settled into his high-backed chair, his expression one of impatience mixed with self-satisfaction. To him, this case was a formality, another cog in the machinery of justice as he saw fit to define it. He tapped his gavel once. "Court is back in session," he announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. His eyes scanned the room, resting briefly on Angela. The faintest smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. He expected her to remain quiet, defeated even. But Angela had never been one to play to expectations. The prosecutor, Daniel Reed, wasted no time, launching into his closing argument. His tone was sharp, confident, and rehearsed, each word meant to paint Marcus Monroe as nothing more than a troublemaker, a man who resisted law enforcement and deserved the punishment the court would undoubtedly hand down. He waved dismissively toward the evidence the defense had attempted to introduce earlier, calling it a distraction and irrelevant to the facts. Angela watched him carefully, her gaze steady and unyielding. Every word he spoke felt like a brick added to the wall Marcus was being forced to climb. But Angela wasn't worried, not yet. She had spent years mastering the art of patience, of waiting for the right moment to act. And that moment was fast approaching. When Reed finally sat down, Judge Whitman leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. His tone, as always, carried an edge of condescension. "Does the defense have any last-minute theatrics to present before we proceed to judgment?" Angela glanced at the defense attorney, who hesitated, his confidence clearly shaken by the judge's dismissive attitude. Before he could speak, Angela rose from her seat. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I'd like to address the court directly." The judge raised an eyebrow, a mixture of amusement and irritation crossing his face. "Miss Monroe, I believe I've given you more than enough time to share your thoughts. Unless you have something new, something relevant to add, I suggest you sit down." Angela didn't waver. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the floor, the sound echoing in the suddenly silent room. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying just enough edge to command attention, "I have something very relevant to say. Something I think this court needs to hear." The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly unimpressed. "Very well," he said with a sigh, gesturing for her to proceed. "But make it quick. I have other cases to hear." Angela stepped to the center of the courtroom, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on Judge Whitman. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, the collective tension thickening the air. But she didn't let it faze her. Instead, she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small black wallet, flipping it open with practiced ease. The shiny badge inside caught the light, gleaming like a beacon in the dimly lit courtroom. "My name," she began, her voice steady and deliberate, "is Special Agent Angela Monroe, United States Secret Service." The room erupted into gasps and murmurs, a ripple of shock spreading through the crowd like wildfire. The prosecutor's jaw visibly tightened, his earlier confidence evaporating in an instant. Even the defense attorney, who had been fumbling through the case, looked up in stunned silence. Judge Whitman, however, remained frozen in his seat, his expression one of disbelief mingled with growing unease. His smirk faltered, and for the first time that day, he seemed at a loss for words. Angela didn't wait for him to respond. She continued, her voice calm but unyielding. "I have spent the last 10 years serving this country, protecting its leaders, and upholding its laws. And I will not stand by while this courtroom, or any courtroom, twists justice to fit a narrative of prejudice and power." The judge finally found his voice, though it wavered slightly. "Agent Monroe," he began, his tone no longer carrying the same air of superiority, "I fail to see how your credentials are relevant to this case." Angela's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, they're very relevant, Your Honor," she replied, "because they speak to my experience, my integrity, and my ability to recognize when someone is abusing their position of power." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring the judge to respond. But he didn't. He couldn't. Instead, the room fell into a tense silence, all eyes shifting between Angela and the man who had so arrogantly dismissed her moments ago. Angela turned to the jury, her gaze steady. "I came here today as a sister, a witness, and a believer in the justice system. But I'm also here as someone who knows what it means to stand for what's right, no matter the cost. Marcus Monroe is not a criminal. He's a man who was unfairly targeted, just like so many others who look like him. And I will not let this court perpetuate that injustice." The tension in the room was palpable, every word Angela spoke driving it higher. Judge Whitman's face had turned an unflattering shade of red, his hands gripping the edges of his bench as though steadying himself. "You've made your point, Agent Monroe," he said finally, his voice strained, "but this court is not the place for grandstanding." Angela stepped closer, her badge still visible, her presence commanding. "This court," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that still managed to carry across the room, "is exactly the place for truth. And it's about time someone told it." For the first time that day, Judge Whitman had nothing to say. The courtroom hung in stunned silence as though the collective weight of Angela's words had sucked all the air out of the room. The badge she held gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, a small but unmistakable symbol of authority that now cast a long shadow over the proceedings. Angela remained where she stood, her presence commanding, her expression unyielding. At the defendant's table, Marcus watched his sister with a mixture of awe and relief. He had always known Angela was strong, but seeing her stand against the judge's arrogance with such composure gave him a sense of hope he hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time since the trial began, he allowed himself to believe that they might actually win. Across the room, Judge Bernard Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his high-backed chair, his hands gripping the arms of the seat so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The faint smirk that had danced on his lips earlier was long gone, replaced by a thin line that betrayed his unease. For years, he had operated with impunity, wielding his gavel like a weapon to silence those he deemed unworthy of respect. But now, faced with Angela Monroe's calm defiance, he felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping in fear. Angela's voice broke the silence, calm but cutting. "Your Honor," she said, her words measured and deliberate, you asked earlier what qualifies me to speak on matters of law enforcement. Allow me to answer that question fully. She stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the judge's bench. The spectators leaned in, their curiosity palpable. Even the court stenographer paused momentarily, her fingers hovering over the keys, unable to look away. I have spent the past decade serving as a special agent with the United States Secret Service, Angela continued, her voice steady. In that time, I have conducted investigations, protected national leaders, and upheld the principles of justice that this country was founded on. My badge is not just a symbol of authority, it is a commitment to truth, fairness, and the rule of law. Her words echoed through the room, each syllable carrying weight. The prosecutor, Daniel Reed, fidgeted in his seat, his earlier confidence now replaced by a nervous energy. He glanced toward the judge, silently willing him to regain control of the narrative. But Judge Whitman seemed frozen, his usually sharp tongue dulled by the sheer force of Angela's presence. Angela turned her attention to the jury, her gaze sweeping across their faces. You've been asked to make a judgment today, she said, her tone softening but losing none of its strength. But how can we expect justice to be served when the scales are tipped before the trial even begins? My brother Marcus has been painted as a criminal, not because of his actions, but because of the color of his skin. And that bias didn't start with the arresting officer, it permeates every level of this system, including this courtroom. A murmur rippled through the spectators, the weight of her words sinking in. One of the jurors, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She glanced toward the judge, then back at Angela, as though re-evaluating everything she had heard so far. Judge Whitman cleared his throat, attempting to reassert control. Miss Monroe, he began, his voice trembling slightly. Agent Monroe, Angela corrected him, her tone razor-sharp. The correction landed like a slap, silencing him instantly. And with all due respect, Your Honor, I'm not finished. The judge's mouth opened, then closed again. He leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of anger and humiliation. For the first time in his long career, he was powerless to dictate the flow of his own courtroom. Angela returned to the defendant's table, placing her badge carefully on the wooden surface. It sat there, a silent reminder of her authority, glinting in the light as if daring anyone to challenge it. She placed her hands flat on the table and leaned forward, addressing the entire room. The evidence is clear, she said, her voice steady. The video shows Marcus being pushed to the ground without cause. Witnesses have testified to the officer's aggressive behavior. Yet this court has chosen to dismiss those facts, to ignore the truth in favor of a narrative that fits a deeply ingrained bias. She straightened, letting her words sink in before continuing. But I will not allow my brother, or anyone else, to be railroaded by a system that values power over justice. Not today, not ever. The room erupted into hushed whispers, the tension reaching a boiling point. Angela stepped back, her posture calm but firm, and returned to her seat beside Marcus. He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, pride. Judge Whitman sat motionless for a moment, his face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its usual authority. Agent Monroe, he said, each word carefully measured, while your credentials are impressive, they do not grant you the right to undermine this court. Angela met his gaze, her expression unreadable. I'm not here to undermine this court, Your Honor. I'm here to ensure that justice is served. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps it's worth asking yourself why. The judge's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening. He glanced toward the prosecutor, who was now frantically flipping through his notes, searching for a way to regain the upper hand. But there was nothing he could say, nothing he could do to undo the shift in power that Angela had created. The courtroom sat in tense silence, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone in the room knew that something monumental had just occurred, though the full weight of it had yet to settle. Judge Whitman adjusted his robe, his movements stiff and mechanical. This court will take a recess, he announced, his voice lacking its usual force. We will reconvene shortly. He banged his gavel and rose from his seat, his robe billowing behind him as he exited the room. But the sound of the gavel, meant to signify authority, felt hollow like the last gasp of a man who had lost control of his own kingdom. Angela watched him go, her expression unreadable. She turned to Marcus and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "Not by a long shot." And as the doors closed behind the judge, Angela knew that the battle was far from finished. But for the first time, the tide had turned, and justice felt just within reach. The courtroom remained in a stunned silence long after Judge Whitman had stormed out, his gavel strike still echoing faintly in the ears of those present. Conversations broke out in hushed whispers among the spectators, but Angela Monroe remained seated at the defense table, her expression calm and composed. She had weathered storms far more intense than this one. Beside her, Marcus sat silently, his eyes fixed on her as though searching for reassurance. "Angie," he said quietly, leaning toward her, "you really shook him. I've never seen a judge look so rattled in my life." Angela didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached for a glass of water on the table, her movements measured and deliberate. She took a small sip before setting it down again. Only then did she turn to her brother, her voice soft but firm. "This isn't about rattling him, Marcus. It's about exposing the truth. And truth has a way of making the arrogant uncomfortable." Marcus nodded, but his unease was still evident. "Do you think it's enough? Do you think he'll actually listen?" Angela's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, a small crack in her otherwise stoic exterior. "Judges like Whitman don't listen, Marcus. They react. And when they're cornered, they either double down or crumble under the weight of their own hubris. Either way, we're ready." The recess stretched on longer than anyone expected. Outside the courtroom doors, the corridors of the Fulton County Courthouse buzzed with activity. Reporters who had initially paid little attention to the case were now gathered in clusters, their notebooks and cameras at the ready. News of Angela's revelation had spread like wildfire, and the courthouse had become a hive of speculation. Angela remained seated at the defense table, her back straight, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. She didn't flinch under the curious stares of the onlookers who had lingered in the gallery. Some looked at her with admiration, others with skepticism, but none could ignore the quiet authority she exuded. Finally, the heavy double doors opened, and the bailiff's voice boomed. "All rise. Court is back in session." Angela stood slowly, her movements deliberate. Beside her, Marcus rose as well, his breathing steady but shallow. Judge Whitman entered the room, his face flushed but his expression tightly controlled. If the recess had given him time to collect himself, it was clear he still hadn't regained the full confidence he had wielded earlier. He took his seat, his gavel clutched tightly in one hand. For a moment, he simply sat there, his gaze sweeping the room as though daring anyone to challenge his authority. But the cracks in his demeanor were evident, a slight tremor in his hand, a tightness around his mouth. Angela saw it all. "Before we proceed," Judge Whitman began, his voice carefully measured, "I feel it necessary to remind this court of the rules of decorum. While Agent Monroe's credentials are notable, they do not grant her immunity from the standards of conduct expected in this courtroom." Angela met his gaze evenly, her expression unchanging. She said nothing, allowing the weight of her silence to settle over the room. It wasn't defiance, it was control. And it unnerved the judge more than any outburst ever could. The prosecutor, Daniel Reed, took the opportunity to jump in. "Your Honor," he began, rising to his feet, "I'd like to request that we refocus on the facts of this case. Agent Monroe's testimony, while compelling, is ultimately irrelevant to the charges at hand." Angela's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. She knew this tactic well: minimize, redirect, diminish. It was the playbook of those who felt their power slipping. But she also knew that facts had a way of cutting through even the thickest veil of arrogance. The defense attorney, emboldened by Angela's presence, rose to his feet. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firmer than before, "Agent Monroe's testimony is not only relevant, it's critical. The video evidence she reviewed, the witnesses she spoke to, these are not just opinions. They are verifiable truths that this court has a duty to consider." Judge Whitman sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. "Enough," he snapped, his voice cracking slightly. "We will review the evidence once more, but I will not allow this court to devolve into a spectacle. The bailiff stepped forward, loading the video evidence onto the courtroom's projector. The screen flickered to life, displaying the grainy footage of Marcus's arrest. Angela watched closely, her eyes scanning every frame, even though she had already memorized every detail. The video was damning, not against Marcus, but against the officer who had escalated the situation without cause. The courtroom fell silent as the video played, the sound of the officer's harsh commands and Marcus's calm responses echoing in the room. The moment when Marcus was shoved to the ground played in slow motion, his body hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. Gasps rippled through the spectators, followed by uneasy murmurs. Angela glanced toward the jury, noting the shifting expressions on their faces: doubt, unease, even guilt. The truth was beginning to break through. When the video ended, Judge Whitman leaned forward, his hands folded tightly in front of him. "The evidence is clear," he said, his voice strained, "but this does not excuse the defendant's actions." Angela rose from her seat, her movements slow and deliberate. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "the evidence does not just excuse my brother's actions, it exonerates him. What this court has witnessed today is not just the truth, but the reality of a system that fails to uphold justice for everyone." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. The spectators sat in silence, the weight of her statement pressing down on them like a stone. Judge Whitman's face darkened, his hands clenching the edge of his bench. "Agent Monroe," he said, his tone icy, "you are walking a fine line." Angela stepped closer, her gaze locked on his. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering, "I'm walking the only line that matters, the line of truth." The courtroom erupted into whispers, the tension reaching a boiling point. Judge Whitman banged his gavel, the sound sharp and jarring. "Order," he barked, his voice trembling. "I will have order in my courtroom." But the authority in his voice was gone, replaced by desperation. Angela returned to her seat, her expression calm but resolute. She had done what she came to do. Now it was up to the system to decide whether it would rise to the challenge or crumble under the weight of its own failures. The judge's gavel fell once more, but this time it felt less like a declaration of authority and more like the desperate act of a man trying to maintain control of a crumbling facade. As the court adjourned for the day, Angela placed her hand on Marcus's shoulder. "This isn't the end," she said quietly. "We're closer than we've ever been." Marcus nodded, his eyes filled with a renewed sense of hope. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to believe that justice might actually be within reach. And as the courtroom doors closed behind them, Angela knew that the fight was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The hallways of the Fulton County Courthouse were unusually quiet as Angela Monroe walked side by side with her brother Marcus, their steps echoing against the polished marble floors. Angela's face remained calm, her expression unreadable, but Marcus could see the subtle tension in the tightness of her jaw, the way her fingers lightly flexed as though gripping an invisible weight. Marcus finally broke the silence. "Do you think he'll actually let the evidence change anything?" he asked, his voice low and uncertain. "Or is this just another show where they pretend to listen but already know the ending?" Angela paused, turning to face him. The fluorescent lights above cast a soft glow on her features, and for a moment, she simply studied her brother's face. "Marcus," she said gently, "I've been in rooms with people who think they control everything, people with power, influence, and arrogance to match. They all have one thing in common: they crumble when the truth comes out. Judge Whitman is no different. He knows the walls are closing in." Marcus looked at her, his shoulders sagging slightly. "But what if he still finds a way to twist this? What if he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Angela placed a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "If he twists this, we untwist it. If he blocks the truth, we push harder. This isn't just about you, Marcus. It's about every person who's ever walked into a courtroom and been judged before they even open their mouth. And I won't stop until they see that." Her words were firm, unwavering, and for the first time that day, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "You always know what to say," he murmured. Angela's lips twitched into a faint grin. "Comes with the territory." When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. It was subtle at first, just a faint undercurrent of tension in the way the spectators whispered among themselves, the way the bailiff's eyes lingered on Judge Whitman as he entered the room. But Angela felt it, and she knew it was more than just the fallout from her earlier revelation. Judge Whitman took his seat, his movements stiffer than before. His face was carefully neutral, but Angela could see the faint lines of strain around his eyes, the way his fingers tapped lightly against the gavel as though testing its weight. He cleared his throat, the sound loud and sharp in the otherwise silent room. "This court is prepared to hear closing arguments," he announced, his voice carrying a forced authority. "However, I would remind everyone present that this is a court of law, not a stage for personal grievances or theatrics." Angela met his gaze from across the room, her expression unflinching. If he thought his thinly veiled warning would intimidate her, he was mistaken. The prosecutor, Daniel Reed, rose to deliver his closing statement. He adjusted his tie and stepped to the center of the courtroom, his usual confidence restored, or at least carefully performed. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his voice smooth and practiced, "what we have seen here today is a distraction. The defense has attempted to shift focus away from the facts of this case, presenting irrelevant testimony and emotional appeals that have no bearing on the charges against the defendant." He paced slowly as he spoke, his eyes scanning the jury. "The truth is simple: Marcus Monroe resisted arrest. The evidence supports this. The officer's testimony supports this. And while the defense may wish to muddy the waters, the law is clear." Angela watched him carefully, her expression neutral. She didn't interrupt, didn't flinch, didn't so much as blink. She had learned long ago that silence could be its own kind of power, and she wielded it now with precision. Reed concluded his statement with a flourish, returning to his seat with a smug smile. But as he sat down, Angela saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the faintest crack in his composure. When the defense attorney rose to speak, Angela leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped in front of her. The young lawyer's earlier nervousness had diminished, replaced by a quiet determination that Angela recognized as the result of her earlier stand. She had given him confidence, and now he was using it. "Your Honor, members of the jury," the attorney began, his voice steady, "this case is not about resisting arrest. It's about accountability. It's about recognizing when those in positions of power have abused that power. And it's about ensuring that justice is not just a word we say, but a principle we uphold." He gestured toward the screen where the video evidence had played earlier. "You've seen the footage. You've heard the testimony. Marcus Monroe did not resist arrest. He was assaulted, humiliated, and wrongfully accused. And this court has a duty to acknowledge that truth." As he spoke, Angela glanced at the jury. She could see the impact of his words in their faces, the way their expressions softened, the way their eyes shifted toward Marcus with something that looked like understanding. The attorney finished his statement, his voice carrying a quiet conviction. "Justice demands courage. I urge you to show that courage today." When the attorney sat down, the room fell into a heavy silence. All eyes turned to Judge Whitman, who sat motionless, his face unreadable. For a long moment, he simply stared at the papers in front of him, his fingers brushing the edge of his gavel. Finally, he looked up, his gaze sweeping the room. "The jury will now deliberate," he announced, his voice tight. "Court is adjourned until a verdict is reached." He banged his gavel and rose quickly, exiting the room before anyone could speak. The bailiff instructed everyone to remain seated until the judge had left, and then the room erupted into quiet murmurs. Angela turned to Marcus, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. "This is it," she said quietly. "Now we wait." Marcus nodded, his hands fidgeting slightly on the table. "Do you think they'll see it? The jury, I mean." Angela placed a hand on his arm, steadying him. "They saw it, Marcus. They just have to decide if they're brave enough to act on it." And as the courtroom slowly emptied, Angela remained seated, her mind turning over every detail, every moment, every possibility. She knew the fight wasn't over, not yet. But she also knew that the truth had a way of breaking through, even in the darkest places. For now, all they could do was wait. The wait was excruciating. Hours passed, the hands of the clock in the courtroom ticking forward with an almost mocking slowness. Angela Monroe sat beside her brother Marcus at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her composure was unshaken, but inwardly, her mind was alive with possibilities. She knew better than to predict an outcome, especially one as precarious as this. The system didn't favor truth, it favored those who controlled the narrative. And for so long, Judge Whitman and men like him had controlled it. Marcus shifted beside her, the weight of uncertainty heavy on his broad shoulders. "Angie," he whispered, breaking the silence, "what if this doesn't go our way?" Angela turned to him, her gaze steady and calm. "If it doesn't," she said softly, "we keep fighting. This case is just one battle, Marcus. The war for justice is bigger than this room, bigger than this verdict. You're not alone in this." Her words weren't just for him, they were for herself as well. She needed to believe in the resilience of truth, even in a system designed to suppress it. Finally, the bailiff opened the door and stepped into the courtroom. "All rise," he called, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The jury has reached a verdict." The spectators shuffled to their feet, the air thick with anticipation. Angela rose slowly, smoothing the front of her blazer. Marcus stood beside her, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Angela placed a steadying hand on his arm, grounding him. Judge Bernard Whitman entered the room, his expression carefully neutral, but Angela noticed the slight stiffness in his movements, the way his eyes avoided meeting hers as he took his seat. The gavel struck the desk with a sharp crack, and the courtroom fell silent. "Be seated," Judge Whitman commanded. The room obeyed in unison, the creak of wooden benches filling the silence. The foreperson of the jury, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a nervous demeanor, stood. In her hands, she held a folded piece of paper that seemed impossibly small for the weight it carried. She cleared her throat, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "Your Honor," she began, "the jury has reached a unanimous decision." Angela's heart beat steadily, her calm exterior masking the storm of emotions beneath. She glanced at Marcus, who was staring straight ahead, his jaw clenched tightly. This was it, the moment that would determine not just his fate, but a small piece of justice in a system that had failed so many. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Whitman instructed, his voice devoid of emotion. Marcus stood, his large frame somehow looking smaller under the weight of the judge's gaze. Angela rose beside him, her presence a quiet but powerful show of solidarity. The foreperson unfolded the paper, her hands shaking slightly. She glanced at Marcus, then at the judge, before finally reading aloud. "On the charge of resisting arrest," she said, her voice trembling, "we find the defendant, Marcus Monroe, not guilty." The words hung in the air for a moment, as if the room itself needed time to process them. Then, like a dam breaking, a wave of murmurs swept through the gallery. Some gasped in relief, others in disbelief. Angela closed her eyes for the briefest moment, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Beside her, Marcus's knees buckled slightly, and she steadied him with a firm hand on his arm. "Order!" Judge Whitman barked, banging his gavel. "I will have order in this courtroom." The noise subsided, but the tension didn't. The judge's face was tight, his lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced at Angela, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place, resentment, perhaps, or the sting of being outmaneuvered. Either way, she held his gaze without flinching. "The defendant is free to go," Whitman said curtly, the words forced through gritted teeth. "This court is adjourned." He struck the gavel one final time and rose, his robe billowing as he left the room without another word. The courtroom erupted as soon as the judge was gone. Marcus turned to Angela, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Angie," he whispered, his voice cracking, "we did it." "No," Angela said softly, her expression warm but resolute, "you did it. The truth did it." He pulled her into a tight embrace, his shoulders shaking as weeks of tension finally gave way to relief. Angela held him, her arms strong and steady, a quiet anchor in the storm around them. Reporters began to swarm, their cameras flashing, their questions flying. Angela ignored them, her focus entirely on her brother. This wasn't their moment to exploit, it was Marcus's moment to reclaim his dignity, his humanity, and his life. As they left the courthouse, the cool Atlanta air hit them like a bomb. The noise of the crowd followed them outside, but Angela guided Marcus toward a quieter corner of the steps. She turned to him, her hands resting lightly on his shoulders. "This isn't the end, Marcus," she said, her voice firm but kind. This is just the beginning. What happened to you isn't unique, it's systemic. And we can't stop here. We have to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Marcus nodded, his expression a mixture of gratitude and determination. I'll do whatever it takes, Angie. I'll fight, just like you. Angela smiled, a rare softness in her otherwise guarded demeanor. You've already fought, Marcus. And you've already won. She glanced back at the courthouse, its imposing structure standing as a reminder of the battles yet to come. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, a moment to breathe, knowing that they had taken one small but significant step toward justice. And as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the city in shades of gold and crimson, Angela Monroe walked away from the courthouse with her brother by her side, ready for whatever came next. The courthouse steps were still buzzing with life as Angela and Marcus descended them, flanked by a sea of reporters, activists, and onlookers. Camera flashes exploded like fireworks, their incessant popping a reminder that this moment had transcended the confines of a single courtroom. Angela remained composed, her arm gently guiding Marcus through the chaos, shielding him from the overwhelming scrutiny. Agent Monroe, a reporter shouted. What's your next move now that your brother has been acquitted? Will you pursue action against the officer involved? Angela didn't break her stride, her eyes fixed ahead. Today is about my brother and his freedom, she said firmly, her voice calm but unyielding. The fight for justice doesn't end here, but right now, we're taking a moment to breathe. The crowd parted as they reached the bottom of the steps, allowing the siblings a brief reprieve from the spotlight. Angela guided Marcus toward a waiting car, its sleek black exterior glinting under the fading sunlight. A driver stepped out, holding the door open, but Marcus hesitated, turning to face Angela. Angie, he said, his voice low, I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for you. Angela placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady. You don't need to thank me, Marcus. You're my brother. I'll always stand up for you. But what happens next, that's up to you. Use this freedom to make a difference, to be the man I know you are. He nodded, swallowing hard. I will. Months later, Angela sat in her modest but neatly kept apartment, reviewing documents spread across her dining table. The case against the arresting officer had gained traction in the wake of Marcus's acquittal, spurred by public outrage and the undeniable evidence presented in court. Activists, legal scholars, and even some lawmakers had taken notice, calling for deeper investigations into systemic biases in the justice system. Angela had quietly stepped into a role she hadn't anticipated, an advocate not just for her brother, but for countless others who had been wronged by a flawed system. She balanced her work as a Secret Service agent with her newfound mission, speaking at community forums, meeting with legal reform organizations, and lending her voice to the growing demand for accountability. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention from the papers. It was Marcus. Hey, Angie, he said, his voice carrying a new lightness she hadn't heard in years. I just wanted to let you know I spoke at a youth center today. Told my story. A lot of those kids, they're going through what I went through. I think it made a difference. Angela smiled, pride swelling in her chest. That's amazing, Marcus. I'm proud of you. You should have seen their faces, he continued. I told them what you told me, that the fight isn't over, but that doesn't mean we stop fighting. Angela leaned back in her chair, her heart full. You're doing good work, Marcus. Keep going. They talked for a few more minutes before hanging up, and Angela sat in the quiet of her apartment, her thoughts drifting. The road ahead was long, filled with battles yet to be fought. But moments like this reminded her why she kept going. Weeks later, Angela stood at the front of a packed auditorium, the bright lights of the stage casting her in sharp relief. The room was filled with community members, lawyers, students, and activists, all gathered for a panel on systemic reform. Angela had been invited to speak not as an agent of the Secret Service, but as a sister, a witness, and a warrior for justice. She stepped up to the podium, the crowd falling silent as she began. Justice is not a guarantee, she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. It is something we have to fight for, something we have to demand. My brother's story is just one of many, but it's a reminder that when we stand together, when we refuse to be silenced, change is possible. She paused, letting the words sink in. This isn't just about Marcus or about me. It's about every person who has been silenced, dismissed, or wrongfully judged. It's about building a system that values humanity over bias, truth over power. The crowd erupted into applause, but Angela remained still, her gaze sweeping the room. She felt the weight of her words, the responsibility they carried. And yet, she also felt hope, a quiet but persistent hope that things could change, that the ripples of this moment could grow into waves. As she stepped back from the podium, the applause swelling around her, Angela knew the fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready. She had found her purpose not just in protecting others, but in standing up for what was right. And as the crowd rose to their feet, their voices joining together in a chorus of support, Angela Monroe walked off the stage, her head held high, ready to face whatever came next. Don't miss out on more powerful stories like this. Subscribe to Adam Alpha for the latest updates.